the book and genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Ram. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab, and Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon, and Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, and Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king. David the king begot Solomon by her, who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon begot Rehoboam, and Rehoboam begot Abijah, and Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat begot Joram, and Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham, and Jotham begot Ahaz, and Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh, and Manasseh begot Amon, and Amon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. And after they were brought to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Shealtiel, and Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel begot Abiud, and Abiud begot Eliakim, and Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok, and Zadok begot Achim. And Achim begot Eliud, and Eliud begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan, and Mathan begot Jacob. And Jacob begot Joseph, who was husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon were 14 generations, and from the captivity in Babylon until Christ were 14 generations.
As the Old Testament concluded, and the 400 years of silence from the prophets began, the Old Testament ended on a promise of a Messiah to come not only to the Jewish nation, but to the whole world. The Old Testament predicted the Messiah would come from the line of King David. We get two accounts of Jesus' genealogy in the New Testament, one from Luke and one from Matthew, the gospel that we are going to be looking at now. Now, each of the accounts presents different themes that were important to each writer in their telling of Jesus' life. The first book we come to in the New Testament is Matthew. And what better place to start to have at the beginning of this New Testament than a connection and a fulfillment of that long-awaited prophecy. The genealogy and connecting line between both testaments show how interwoven these two testaments are. Matthew presents the genealogy to Jesus from Abraham, who we know as the father of the Jewish nation. And we know the gospel, according to Matthew, focused more on that Jewish connection and the Messiah aspect, while Luke focused more on the Greeks who were more interested in the culture and beauty and ideas of the world. Luke fills his books with insights, interviews, songs, and details that fascinate the inquiring mind. And we see that with Luke going all the way back to Adam in his genealogy, pinpointing the worldwide message of the gospel, according to him. We also know of Matthew's background as a tax collector and his deep understanding and love for numbers, as his gospels hold the most references to money and numbers more than any other gospel. Now, both genealogies are basically the same from Abraham to David, but they diverge from David to Jesus. Matthew follows the line of his son Solomon, while Luke follows Nathan, another son. There are different beliefs as to why we get two different genealogies, possibly one from Mary and the other from Joseph, or a legal one versus a biological one, or even an interesting theory on an Old Testament law about a brother's widow. No matter which possibility, each one presents a different argument and has a different message they are trying to portray. The very way Matthew begins his genealogy is important. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. We see the phrase, the book of the genealogy of, one other place in the whole Bible. And that phrase, and that is in Genesis 5, where it is said, the book of the genealogy of Adam. So a first century Jew will pick up that phrase from the beginning and see the connections as the new beginning for humans in the world. We also see that all four Gospels reference back to Genesis. There is a connection between the Old Testament. The reason David and Abraham are brought up is because of the promissory covenants made with them. The Old Testament says something special about each man's seed. The seed of David would reign over the world forever, and the seed of Abraham was going to bring blessings to the whole world. It is Jesus who is the fulfillment of those two prophecies. As we get into the rest of the genealogy, we see Matthew arranges it into 3 sets of 14 generations. We see that at the end, in verse 17, we read, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations. And from the captivity in Babylon until Christ are 14 generations. We could get into a long discussion about the use of numbers in the Bible. But we do know Matthew is connecting David with Jesus using the number 14, which is also the double of the holy number 7, which is a sacred number used by God. We are familiar with the Bible. As we are familiar with the Bible, we know that the number 7 is prominent in the Bible. God creates the world in 6 days and rests on the 7th. It is that pattern that the Sabbath is based on. That means in this genealogy, there were 6 sets of 7 in the genealogy. So 3 times 14 would be 6 sets of 7. So that means that the 7th set of the 7 generations had begun. That starting with Jesus, the 7th set of 7 years has begun. Kind of like as we talked about with the Jubilee in last lesson. A holy of holy generations was being started, and it was being seen with Jesus's birth. So with Jesus appearing in that 6th set of 7 at the end, it is a parallel to how God created in 6 days, 6 sets of 7, and then until on the 7th day, or in this case, the 7th set of 7, God himself appeared on earth and walked among the world. On this aspect of name, on the list of names, one interesting fact that people have mentioned in Matthew's genealogy is that it is a leaning in. So it's a leaning in. What does that mean? Well, the genealogy starts from Abraham, a lowly wanderer, to David, a great king of Israel and the nation. Then from David to the fall in the Babylonian captivity. Then from the fall to Jesus and his triumphal kingship. And that is why I believe there are 3 sets of 14 to make that in, the rise and fall. You see the rise and fall, then rise again of the Jewish nation, ending with the King of Kings. Looking at the names in this list, though, on a quick glance, there's only 41 names. One less than a full set of 13 times 14 names, as Matthew said. One less. From Shetel to Jesus, it is only 13 names. But one thought or reason why Matthew says that it is 14 generations, I believe, comes from the fact was that Jesus was raised from the dead. Jesus was that 13th and 14th person, because as stated in 1 Corinthians 15:14, without Christ rising from the dead, our faith is in vain. It was Christ defeating death and being spiritually born again, just like how we Christians are in baptism, symbolizing that sacrifice, are too born again. Jesus, that 13th generation, was the sacrifice for mankind's sin. And after his death and resurrection, he became that completion, that 14th generation and king, exemplified by David's kingship and bringing that in back to its highest point. Matthew here is telling us the full story of the gospel, full story of Matthew is written right here in these first few verses. He knows that the end of the story and summarizes the rise of Jesus to be that sacrifice and that king for us. Now, there may be some people who do not agree with that understanding, that he is the 13th and 14th group. So I'll give another way to understand these 3 sets of 14, another idea that some people put forth. It is as said in verse 17, counting the captivity to be where the last set of the genealogy that starts in the genealogy. So as it says, from Abraham to David, that is 14 generations. Yep, that works. That's 14 generations. From David until the captivity in Babylon, and now just based on the names in Matthew, that would go from David to Josiah, which is the last free king mentioned before Jeconiah goes into captivity. So that would be 14 names. Then we see in verse 12 that it goes from while in captivity, the line goes from Jeconiah to Jesus, which makes 14 generations. The way this splits up does count David twice, as mentioned in verse 17, and says that Jeconiah starts the last generation because he is connected with captivity in Babylon. Either way, whether it's he's the 13th and 14th, or whether it's counting David twice, Matthew is putting the names there for a reason. And he knew what he was doing when he was putting together the genealogy. He didn't make a mistake. He's the guy with numbers. There is a reason for it. We see how in Matthew, he starts his genealogy with Abraham because of his focus on the Jewish nature of Jesus and his connection with the throne. One special thing to notice too is the presence of 4 women in this genealogy. Perez and Zerah by Tamar, that is the first one mentioned. Boaz by Rahab, that is the second woman. Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, third woman. David the king begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. That's Bathsheba, but she isn't mentioned by name, but that's the 4th person. So what is unique about these women besides being included in the list? All 4 women were either Gentiles or associated with Gentiles. Tamar was a Canaanite, the daughter-in-law of Judah, by whom she had Perez and Zerah. Second, Rahab was also a Canaanite, and more specifically, a Jerichoite. She hid the spies. Ruth was a Moabite. And finally, the wife of Uriah, who is Bathsheba, While we don't know her full status, we do know who she was married to, and that was Uriah, who was a Hittite, a Gentile. So already not a fully Jewish family. All four also had checkered romantic histories. Tamar bore children through an illicit encounter with her father-in-law Judah by posing as a prostitute. She also produced about 90% of Judah's descendants. 90%. So most of Judah's heirs came from a Canaanite woman who tricked her father-in-law and acted as a prostitute. Matthew included Tamar in the genealogy to give some humility to the Jews. We know how proud they were of their ancestry. We see that with them always calling back to Abraham and Moses. Even in the New Testament, we see this even coming up later in Matthew, specifically Matthew 3:9, where John the Baptist tells the Pharisees and Sadducees, "And do not think to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I say to you that God is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones." Our ancestry is not that illustrious and is affected by that world of sin that we are in. They are all basically half Canaanites. Jesus was going to break the Jews' expectations, just like how the lineage of the Jews wasn't as glamorous as the Jews made it out to be. We see at the end of Matthew, Jesus says to make more followers from all the nations, not just the Jews. So recognizing the Gentiles in the Jewish line connects the two nations, connects the groups. The beginning and the end of the Gospel of Matthew, we see Matthew is preparing the reader that there is a lot more surprises and a lot more offenses that are going to occur in this gospel, and where Jesus is going to defy certain expectations. As we carry on, we go to Rahab. So that was all from Tamar. As we carry on, we go to Rahab. Rahab was a Jerichoite, but we know she ran a brothel in Jericho. We find that in Joshua 2:1. She protected the Hebrew spies, and because she protected them, they protected her and her family. She eventually married into the line of Judah and became the ancestor to King David. Now Ruth, another one, attempts at the direction of her mother-in-law to try and seduce Boaz while he is drunk, who does not fall for it but ends up properly marrying her. We also know this story with the wife of Uriah, who's Bathsheba, where David commits the sin of adultery with her and killed her husband. So they all were Gentiles or connected with Gentiles with checkered pasts. What Matthew is doing by presenting the sins and issues of the royal kingly ancestry is preparing us and the Jews to receive Jesus. We know we're criticized for hanging around Gentiles with sinners and those who were unclean. The arguments against Jesus because of who he helped and who he was around would be null and void because it was Gentiles and prostitutes that were in the line of the kings already. They were not immune to the history. We also see the parallels and contrasts Matthew is presenting with the history of the Jews and the royal line of Judah being marred by sin. And while Jesus's conception was in purity through his birth of a virgin and the righteous man Joseph, while the line was corrupt and marred by sin, the birth of Jesus was the pure act as the Virgin of Mary and Joseph. We also see at the end of the genealogy that Matthew isn't focused on biology here, because when he gets down to Joseph, we see him mentioned in verse 16, and Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. He doesn't say Joseph begot Jesus or was the father of Jesus, but rather the husband of Mary. And it was through Mary that Jesus was born. The break in rhythm there, where everyone was, this person begot this person begot this person, it was broken at the very end. The break in rhythm there and the different description of the relationship between Joseph and Jesus shows that it wasn't the biology that was the matter at hand. So what mention the history of Joseph at all? Well, the point here is the legality and who has the right to the throne. It was Jesus's inheritance by being the rightful heir of Judah and the rightful king of Israel. One thing I've seen is some people bring up the curses placed on previous kings and heirs to the throne in Israel, because we read in the Old Testament about curses placed on some kings. We know that one of the last direct descendants of David, Jeconiah, son of Jehoiakim, was placed under a curse in Jeremiah 22, verse 24 and 30. It was stated that none of Jeconiah's sons would sit on the throne, and that while Jeconiah was a signet ring to God, he would now pull him off his finger. Well, there you got a conundrum. Well, how do you get someone to sit on the throne and inherit the throne without being under that curse, as some people bring up? The answer comes a few verses later. There is the talk starting in Jeremiah 52:31, that Jeconiah was taken out of prison and sat on a throne above the kings in Babylon. So possibly, it sounds like he repented of his ways, and that is why he was given power again. But that's not a straight answer. But in Haggai 2:23, Zerubbabel, Jeconiah's grandson, was talking with Haggai, who, speaking God's word, said that God would make Zerubbabel like a signet ring, for he has chosen him. That is the same thing, the exact same thing God took away from Jeconiah. So this is the renewal of that promise and the restoring of the kingly line. So there's no issue here, as some people I've seen written have mentioned. There's no issue with any curses or anything anymore. There's also one fascinating aspect of the name Jacob being mentioned twice in the lineage. Of course, I'm going to have to focus on Jacob a little. We know. In the Old Testament, we meet Jacob, who has 12 sons, each of whom becomes a tribe. Well, 2 of those sons stood out and had a bit of a royal reputation. In Genesis, Jacob blesses Judah and says the scepter will never depart from him. Later on in Deuteronomy, Moses says of Joseph, another son of Jacob, that he was a prince among his brothers. So there are these 2 sons with royal destinies. And when Jacob is mentioned in the genealogy here in Matthew, what are the 2 names that are mentioned here after each mention of Jacob? Well, the first is at the top, the original Judah, who was mentioned would have the scepter. Then at the very end, we see Joseph, the father of Jesus. Who is his grandfather? A man with the name Jacob as well. I think it's just a nice coincidence that the father of Joseph was Jacob, kind of tying back to Joseph being a prince among his brothers. Jacob begot Joseph. And also, another side thing is that Jesus' brother in Hebrew was named Yaakov, which is where in English we get the name Jacob. But sadly, the brother is commonly known as James. His commonly known, people know him as James, which is a French corruption of the name, is the Latin translation of Jacob. So I would rather call James Jacob, but that's just me. We do see Matthew being more focused on Joseph in his gospel and the thoughts of Joseph through his birth, through the birth of Jesus, which makes sense because Matthew goes through his line, while Luke likely goes through Mary's line. One question that arises, though, is is the fact that Luke has Heli as the father of Joseph and Matthew as Jacob. Well, with Luke's account, we know with Jewish law, when an only daughter got married to her husband, the new son-in-law would become the full legal heir to her father and got all the rights and privileges as a full son. These even extended to being listed as an heir to her father in genealogies. We have examples of this way of inheritance in the Old Testament, specifically in Numbers 27 and Numbers 36. We see this happening in the Old Testament. Now, even if that isn't the case for Mary to be an only child, another possibility based on biblical law comes into play. I'm referring to the brother's widow's law. The law was that if a man's brother died while the dead brother's wife had no living children, the living brother must marry the widow, and the first son would carry on the dead brother's name. This is so much of an idea that some historical church members, some people, have held this to be the case happening with Jesus. The idea is that Heli, mentioned in Luke, died childless. So this caused Jacob to take his wife and further his line and his name, fathering Joseph. So Joseph was by nature the son of Jacob, but by law, he was the son of Heli. Now, these are just two possibilities for the point, but either way, we see the point Matthew's trying to make with this genealogy. Now, before I get to my closing remarks, I'll have that at the end. I see that we're early, so I don't want to end too fast. But because it's a Sunday night, we can do some questioning and answering, because I'm sure Diane's got some questions. Just a few. But so I'll take some questions and we can talk about some stuff, and then I'll do my closing part at the very end. So if we have any questions, Diane, I'll take your question. So you're asking, does the genealogy in Luke and the genealogy in Matthew ever cross? I'm not exactly sure. I know, so it doesn't cross. It crosses before David, but like I mentioned at the start, they both take a different route once it gets to David. From Abraham to David, it's the same. It's basically the same. But it goes from Solomon in Matthew, and it goes from Nathan in Luke. So they diverge there because they're following two different lines. And so they don't meet. They follow two different lines, basically. Does that kind of answer, or are you still confused? I'm used to it. Yes, Gary.
But then she said Joseph also sent Abraham.
Correct, yeah.
So he wasn't a biological father of Jesus.
He still gets legal. Yeah, and that's why I believe the whole point of Matthew is bringing up is that while he's not the biological son, because obviously he came from God, he still gets the legal authority. He still gets that kingly right from David because he's legally the son of David, son of Joseph. And so that's why I think it's important. That's why I think Matthew focuses a lot of his book about the ideas, because in Matthew we see the thoughts of Joseph more so than some other gospels. And so I think Matthew's focusing more on that side of things versus Mary's side. Any other questions I'm willing to take? No? And so if there's no other questions, I can get to the closing because we have 20 minutes. Or, okay. Do you have any other questions? I don't want to go too early, but.
No, but I do think that what they were both trying to prove, that they were both from the tribe of Judah, you couldn't be a king
without the tribe of Judah.
without that particular tribe. And so whoever looked at the genealogy, whether Joseph was the natural father or not, he was in his household and it all came down through that. Because at that time, there's really only two tribes, Benjamin and Judah.
And they weren't trying to think of it, they weren't embarrassed by the genealogy. We see that with Matthew putting it at the start. We see that with that's the connecting line between the two genealogies. They wouldn't put the genealogies if they weren't confident in the genealogies. And so I think there's a very good message to Matthew's genealogy. And I think there's a reason why he splits them up into 14. Matthew really likes numbers. He's a tax collector. He dealt with numbers his whole life. That's why when you look in his gospel, the amount of times coinage is mentioned. Whenever you're studying Matthew, I just always look and see when you could find when he mentions, a denarius, the parable talking about burying money into the ground. Those all are in Matthew because Matthew focused on money. He was felt comfortable with that in numbers. And so I think that's why 14 was mentioned. There's also the idea that David's name, in Hebrew, you can do like a lot of number translations of letters, and David's name equals 14, which is a whole another thing, which is more on number side. Like I mentioned, you could get a long discussion of numbers, but we don't need to here. But it's definitely important showing that in the rise and fall and rise again of the genealogies. And I think Matthew's main point was to show there was a rise and fall and rise again, and that the genealogies are marred with sin, and that there's not perfect nature in the genealogy. Even going to David the king, it wasn't a perfect line. There was sin throughout. And that's why I think when Pharisees or stuff would harp on Jesus or say on Jesus that he's doing wrong by being with sinners or being with the unclean, it's ironic. It's just them seeing their own way in it and not really seeing what is there. But I'll get to the closing. We've gone through many points and interesting facts in the genealogies according to Matthew, but in the end, the main fact of the matter is that Jesus came for the line of David and Abraham. And Matthew presents a fascinating genealogy in which the Jews would gain special insight because of their knowledge of the Old Testament. His focus on deep Jewish cultural and history is without a doubt in Matthew's genealogy. In the end, we should recognize that Matthew and Luke were not embarrassed by the genealogies of Jesus. Matthew making it the literal start of his writing, and Luke putting it in the 3rd chapter. They weren't embarrassed by Jesus' ancestors because it showed his royal and legal kingship. These names are more important than most people will give them credit for. When my dad got up to read the scripture, the genealogy, guarantee some people were a little tired of hearing the names. This person begot this person. This person begot this person. There's something important there. There is a history there that is there for a reason, and we don't give them as much credit as they deserve. And they play into Matthew's theme in life as a tax collector. Will we see the lineage of Jesus and see his kingly right? Will we recognize Jesus as an heir to the throne? Will we recognize Jesus as the Messiah coming from that Jewish line? If you've come to that belief for the first time and truly believe that he had lived, died, and was resurrected for our sins, and know that desire to be baptized for the remission of sins, would you come forward as together we stand and sing our song?
While we pray and while we plead, will you see your soul's deep need? While your Father calls you home, will you not, my brother, come? Why not now? Why not now? Why not come to Jesus now? Why not now? Why not now? Why not come to Jesus now? You have wandered far away. Do not risk another day. Do not turn from God your face.